What shaped the rivalry between Elizabeth and Mary? The stage for this epic rivalry was set long before the two women even met. And Mary, Queen of Scots, were born into a world where their fates were linked by blinds, but their upbringings couldn't have been more different. Elizabeth, the daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, was born into a royal family fraught with scandal, division, and danger. Her father, a king infamous for his 6 marriages and his brutal severing of ties with the Catholic Church, created a legacy that would haunt Elizabeth throughout her life. From the moment she was born, Elizabeth was thrust into a world where her legitimacy was in question, and the constant shadow of her mother's execution loomed over her. Mary, on the other hand, had a far different beginning. Born in 1542 to James V of Scotland, she inherited the Scottish throne when she was only 6 days old, a child queen in a land plagued by political turmoil. Unlike Elizabeth, who grew up in the turmoil of her father's court, Mary was raised in the relative security of the French court. Married off to the French Dauphin at a young age, the French court was an environment steeped in culture, stability, and wealth, a stark contrast to Elizabeth's world of manipulation, power struggles, and the ever-present threat of assassination. Mary, educated to be a queen from an early age, grew up surrounded by the opulence of France, groomed for a royal life that was very different from the one Elizabeth had to carve out for herself. It wasn't just their upbringings that made their rivalry so intense, it was the pressure they both faced. Elizabeth's life was filled with constant threats to her reign. From the moment her sister Mary I passed away, Elizabeth took the throne under the shadow of accusations about her own legitimacy. Her position as queen was never fully secure. Many believed she was a bastard, and that Mary, Queen of Scots, was the rightful heir to the English throne. These doubts only fueled the rising tensions between the two women. Mary, though, had her own set of problems. As a Catholic queen in a rapidly Protestant England, her reign was always going to be challenged. But her struggles reached new heights when she was forced to flee Scotland after the political instability of her reign reached a boiling point. A victim of both her own bad choices and the forces around her, Mary's departure from Scotland and her subsequent imprisonment in England were not merely the result of personal failures. They were the culmination of the pressure Mary faced to reconcile her role as a Catholic monarch in an increasingly Protestant world. It's easy to view the conflict between Elizabeth and Mary as a simple case of two queens fighting for the throne. After all, the history books tell us that Mary was the rightful heir, and Elizabeth, the bastard daughter of Anne Boleyn, was the pretender. But when we dig deeper, we uncover a story more complex than a mere struggle for power. These two women, born into worlds that couldn't have been more different, were linked by more than blood. They were bound by religion, politics, and the deep divisions within their own countries. But what truly made this rivalry so gripping was not just the stakes of the throne itself, it was the intensity of the personal animosity that developed between these two women. While Elizabeth often presented herself as a figure of strength and dignity, maintaining her status as the Virgin Queen, Mary's life was marked by scandalous marriages, violence, and betrayals. As Elizabeth's power solidified, so too did the notion that Mary was a threat to everything Elizabeth had worked so hard to achieve. And here's the shocking part. What if I told you that their rivalry wasn't just a result of their claims to the throne, or even religious differences? The deepening conflict between Elizabeth and Mary was also a product of the world they lived in, a world where women in power were both revered and despised, their authority constantly questioned. The very fact that these two women were queens meant that they had to navigate a sea of opposition from those who believed that a woman's place was not on the throne. Elizabeth, the more cautious and calculating of the two, managed to maneuver her way into a position where she was not only Queen of England, but a symbol of Protestant England. Mary, on the other hand, became a symbol of Catholic opposition. Every decision Mary made was scrutinized through the lens of religion, while Elizabeth was forced to juggle the competing demands of her Protestant supporters and the political reality of Mary's Catholic claim. At the time Elizabeth became Queen of England, Mary had already been married to the French Dauphin, had lost him to illness, and was embroiled in the chaos of Scotland's religious and political upheavals. But despite her troubled personal life, Mary still had a powerful claim to the English throne. Mary's arrival in England in 1568, after her forced abdication, became the catalyst for what would later escalate into one of history's most intense and complex rivalries. Elizabeth knew that Mary's presence on English soil was a direct challenge to her rule, but instead of acting quickly to have Mary executed, Elizabeth kept her in a sort of royal limbo, imprisoning her for 19 years. Though Mary's claim to the throne never wavered, the complexities of their relationship were not just about politics and power, they were about survival. It wasn't just that Elizabeth and Mary were enemies, they were locked in a struggle for their very lives. Elizabeth's decision to keep Mary imprisoned and deny her the throne was strategic, but it was also dangerous. There was no certainty that Elizabeth's own reign would survive the threat that Mary posed, especially as Catholic factions in Europe continued to push for her execution. For Mary, being imprisoned in England was both a humiliation and an opportunity, a chance to one day reclaim her throne. The true question that looms as we explore their rivalry is, could it have been avoided? Could Elizabeth and Mary have found a way to coexist, or were their fates sealed from the moment they were born into this world of power, politics, and betrayal? The answer to that question, like so many others in history, remains elusive. But what we do know is that this rivalry was more than a fight for the throne. It was a battle that would define the future of England and leave a legacy that would echo through history. Was Mary a real threat to Elizabeth's reign? It's easy to imagine the rivalry between Elizabeth I and Mary, Queen of Scots, as a straightforward clash between two queens vying for the English throne. But as we dive deeper, we uncover layers of complexity. Both queens had legitimate claims to the throne, claims that intertwined their fates in a dangerous web of power struggles. The question that often arises is, was Mary really a direct threat to Elizabeth's rule, or was the rivalry a political construct, a product of the times? Mary Stuart, born into the Scottish royal family, was a legitimate heir to the English throne by virtue of her grandmother, Margaret Tudor, who was Henry V's daughter. This gave Mary a direct blood connection to the English monarchy, making her a formidable contender in the eyes of many. But more than just her royal lineage, it was the circumstances surrounding her reign that made her a significant threat. As a Catholic queen, Mary's very existence was a political challenge to Elizabeth. Many in Catholic Europe, especially Spain and the papacy, considered Elizabeth's reign illegitimate due to her Protestant faith and the circumstances surrounding her mother, Anne Boleyn's marriage to Henry VIII. This was a much deeper issue than mere politics. It was about religious legitimacy. To Catholics, Mary was the rightful Queen of England, and her claim was a rallying point for those seeking to overturn the Protestant Reformation in England. In fact, numerous Catholic plots and uprisings were aimed at replacing Elizabeth with Mary. One of the most significant of these was the Rising of the North in 1569, which saw Catholic lords in England rise up to dethrone Elizabeth. Though the rebellion was unsuccessful, it highlighted the growing number of Catholics who viewed Elizabeth's reign as illegitimate. The problem wasn't just Mary's direct claim to the throne, it was the broader Catholic movement that began to see her as the true monarch. For these factions, putting Mary on the throne wasn't just a political victory, it was a religious one. Here's the strange fact that most people miss. Elizabeth, despite being the reigning queen, was the one who was often seen as the pretender. Her legitimacy was constantly in question, which made her reign precarious. Mary, on the other hand, while beset by political challenges of her own, was seen by many as the rightful queen by blood. This discrepancy in perception was a ticking time bomb that threatened to destabilize not just the monarchy, but the entire Protestant Reformation in England. And here's where it gets really controversial. Some historians argue that Elizabeth, in fact, feared Mary not just as a political rival, but as a symbol of Catholic hope. If Elizabeth allowed Mary to live too long, the power of Catholic Europe would continually pressure her to abdicate. The very existence of Mary as a claimant to the throne created an undercurrent of constant tension in Elizabeth's court. Mary's arrival in England in 1568, after being forced to abdicate the Scottish throne, only deepened the rivalry. By seeking refuge in Elizabeth's court, Mary was placing herself squarely in Elizabeth's realm, both physically and symbolically. The question was, could Elizabeth allow Mary to live in England, a figurehead for Catholic opposition, without risking her own throne? It was a delicate balance. On one hand, Elizabeth could have used Mary as a pawn in the political games of European diplomacy. On the other hand, Mary's continued survival represented a direct threat to Elizabeth's rule and the stability of Protestant England. The conflict wasn't simply about two women fighting for a crown. It was about the forces of religion and politics clashing in a world where a queen's power was fragile at best. Elizabeth had to contend with not just the threat of Mary's claim, but the broader political and religious landscape that viewed her as illegitimate. It was a time when the monarchy wasn't just about personal power. It was about the faith of the people and the stability of the nation. To make matters even more complicated, Elizabeth, who was fiercely protective of her throne, could never be certain who supported Mary. Many of her subjects remained loyal to Catholicism, while others had embraced the Protestant Reformation. This division made it difficult for Elizabeth to take any drastic action without risking civil unrest. The last thing Elizabeth needed was a martyrdom figure, someone who could inspire revolt among Catholics, especially when England's security was already under constant threat from Catholic Europe. Strange reality is that while Elizabeth viewed Mary as a threat, she could not afford to act too aggressively. Mary was, after all, the Queen of Scotland, and killing her outright would set off a firestorm across Europe. In many ways, Mary's continued presence in England represented a kind of political limbo, a situation that kept both queens at odds without fully erupting into war. Now consider this. While Elizabeth's supporters saw her as a symbol of stability and strength, Mary's supporters saw her as a martyr, a victim of political forces beyond her control. In this context, both queens played a dangerous game, one where their very survival depended not just on their actions, but on the perception of legitimacy, power, and loyalty. What becomes clear is that Mary's claim to the throne was not just about personal ambition, it was about the ideological battle between Catholicism and Protestantism, and this, more than anything, made her a real threat to Elizabeth. It was not just a matter of who had the better claim to the throne, it was a question of who could unite the country under their banner. For Elizabeth, keeping Mary alive in England was like keeping a lit match next to a powder keg. The danger of Mary's presence wasn't just her claim, it was the forces she symbolized. As we move forward, we'll explore the religious and political dimensions of their rivalry, and how the conflict between Catholicism and Protestantism became the fuel that stoked the fire of their personal animosity. Was Mary truly a threat to Elizabeth, path? Or was the rivalry built on the fragile foundations of religious ideology and political strategy? Stay tuned as we dive deeper into the clash between these two queens and uncover the hidden forces that shape their fates. Why did Elizabeth refuse to marry when her rivals did? At first glance, Elizabeth's refusal to marry seems like a personal decision, a queen choosing to remain independent. But when you dig deeper, you'll find that it was far more than that. It was a strategic move that shaped her reign and the future of England. Elizabeth I, known as the Virgin Queen, turned what could have been seen as a weakness into a symbol of power, and this decision had profound political implications. It's important to understand that Elizabeth's refusal to marry wasn't about personal preference. It was a calculated choice. She was keenly aware that marriage in her time was not just a union of two people. It was a political alliance. Every suitor she entertained, every marriage proposal that came her way was laced with political motivations. To marry one man would alienate another faction or country. If she married a foreign prince, she risked losing English sovereignty. If she married a nobleman, she risked giving too much power to one family or one faction within England. By remaining unmarried, Elizabeth was able to maintain her complete control over her court, her alliances, and most importantly, her throne. Now, here's the strange part. What most people don't realize is that by remaining single, Elizabeth was actually making a much more powerful statement. She wasn't just a woman trying to navigate a man's world. She was, in fact, the one who was in control. Elizabeth's refusal to marry made it clear to the people of England that her reign was not dependent on a man. It sent a signal to the world that England, under her leadership, was no longer tied to the whims of foreign princes or dynastic marriages. Her decision to stay unmarried was in itself an act of defiance against both the patriarchal expectations of her time and the political pressures mounting on her. But here's where it gets interesting. This refusal didn't come without consequences. To many, Elizabeth's virginity became her greatest political asset, but it was also a source of vulnerability. Many of her Protestant supporters admired her for maintaining her independence, but her refusal to marry also left a dangerous vacuum. As long as Elizabeth remained unmarried, the question of succession hung over her reign like a dark cloud. There was no clear heir to the throne, and this opened the door for potential rivals, like Mary, Queen of Scots, to stake their claim to the English crown. Many believed Elizabeth's refusal to marry had to do with her strong sense of independence and leadership, but there were also whispers about the personal pain behind this decision. It's well known that Elizabeth's father, Henry VIII, had executed two of his wives and had made his life in court a constant theater of personal tragedy. Could it be that Elizabeth feared the same fate for herself, losing power to a husband who could eventually seek to rule in her stead? Could her experiences as the daughter of Anne Boleyn, who had been executed after failing to produce a male heir, haunt her decisions? Perhaps the specter of her mother's tragic death left an indelible mark on her psyche. Here's a rare fact that many don't know. Elizabeth's refusal to marry wasn't entirely unique. In fact, it mirrored the politics of her time in a subtle yet powerful way. It wasn't just about avoiding foreign entanglements or domestic power struggles. It was about signaling that she wasn't to be manipulated. During Elizabeth's reign, many women in positions of power across Europe faced similar scrutiny. Monarchs like Elizabeth were often expected to marry in order to ensure the continuity of their dynasties. Yet Elizabeth's choice to remain unmarried sent a message to the entire European court. She would never be controlled by a marriage. Let's not forget that this decision came with a significant downside. Her lack of a marriage alliance weakened England's relationship with key European powers. In particular, Spain, with its powerful Catholic monarchy, had hoped that Elizabeth might marry one of its princes, perhaps Philip II himself, thus solidifying an alliance between England and Spain. The failure to marry left Elizabeth vulnerable to accusations of being a weak ruler who lacked the ability to secure England's place on the world stage. Now, here's the controversial part. Many historians argue that Elizabeth's refusal to marry actually prolonged her reign. It allowed her to maintain her independence and make decisions based solely on what was best for England, rather than having to consider the political interests of a husband or in-laws. But some critics would say that by staying single, Elizabeth also isolated England from many important alliances that could have helped in times of war or financial crisis. Was she, in fact, playing a dangerous game by refusing marriage? Could she have solidified her power even more if she had formed a strategic alliance through marriage? Despite the political and diplomatic fallout, Elizabeth's decision to remain single became an essential part of her identity. The Virgin Queen wasn't just a title. She became the embodiment of English sovereignty and the national unity of her people. Her single status became a symbol of England's independence, a country that stood alone and strong in the face of foreign threats. Even today, we remember her reign as a golden age, partly because she successfully navigated the complex political landscape without ever marrying. But here's the twist. As Elizabeth's reign progressed, the political landscape around her became even more complex. Her refusal to marry may have kept her in power, but it didn't prevent other forces from trying to undermine her authority. The most notable of these forces was, of course, Mary, Queen of Scots. Mary's claim to the throne was based on her Catholic faith and her bloodline, both of which made her a formidable rival to Elizabeth's Protestant reign. With Mary living in England for 19 years, the pressure on Elizabeth to act against her was immense. And while Elizabeth's refusal to marry Mary seemed to empower her in many ways, it also created the conditions for Mary's rise as a Catholic figurehead. As we continue, we'll explore how Elizabeth's decision not to marry ultimately impacted her relationship with Mary and led to one of the most dramatic and controversial moments of their rivalry. Stay tuned, because we'll uncover the hidden forces that kept these two queens locked in a dangerous struggle for power. You might be surprised by the way Elizabeth's refusal to marry shaped not just her reign, but the future of England itself. How did Mary's marriages fuel her downfall? Mary, Queen of Scots, lived a life that seemed tailor-made for a tragic story, filled with royal ambition, love, betrayal, and scandal. Unlike Elizabeth, who chose to remain single and focused on her political power, Mary's marriages became the key factors that contributed to her undoing. Her love life was far from romantic. It was a political battlefield, where each marriage was more than just a union of hearts. These marriages were crucial decisions, but they were also her greatest mistakes. Mary's first marriage, to the French Dauphin, Francis II, was a political alliance that made her a powerful figure in Europe. At just 15 years old, she was married to the heir to the French throne, becoming Queen Consort of France. For a time, this marriage seemed to offer Mary everything: a vast empire, influence over the French court, and a secure position. But fate would not be kind to her. Francois died young, leaving Mary a widow at just 18. This devastating loss stripped her of not only her husband, but also her political power in France. She was no longer the Queen Consort of France. She was a queen without a crown in a kingdom that wasn't her own. Now, here's a strange fact. Most people think Mary's first marriage to the French Dauphin was a smooth, successful union, but the reality is that Mary's marriage to Francois was largely a political partnership, driven by power rather than passion. Despite their marriage, Francois's mother, Catherine de' Medici, wielded far more power in the French court. After the death of Francois, Mary returned to Scotland, her kingdom in turmoil. The Protestant Reformation had taken hold in Scotland, and Mary's Catholic faith became a major point of contention. Scotland was deeply divided, and Mary's religion made her a figurehead for the Catholic minority. But her next marriage would seal her fate. Her second marriage to Henry VIII, Lord Darnley, would be the beginning of her downfall. Darnley was initially an attractive match for Mary. He was a cousin with a strong claim to the throne of England, and the marriage would create a union of two powerful dynasties. But their relationship quickly soured. Darnley's arrogance, ambition, and self-importance soon became unbearable for Mary. He demanded power and was openly discontent with his lack of influence, which only made matters worse. Their marriage, which began with such promise, quickly descended into scandal and violence. Darnley was openly unfaithful, and Mary's temper flared. Here's the controversial part. While it's easy to blame Darnley for the breakdown of their marriage, some historians argue that Mary's own impulsiveness and decisions also played a role. She chose to marry a man who was far more interested in power than in her well-being. This marriage was not based on genuine love or respect, and it set the stage for a disaster that would unfold. The murder of Lord Darnley shocked everyone. Darnley's death, under mysterious circumstances, was a turning point for Mary. Many suspected foul play, and rumors began to swirl that Mary herself was involved. The scandal surrounding Darnley's death did irreparable damage to Mary's reputation. She was now seen as a queen who could not maintain control over her own life, let alone her kingdom. The murder was never solved, but it was the beginning of the end for Mary. The political fallout from Darnley's death was immense, and the public perception of Mary took a dramatic nosedive. Here's a rare fact. The murder of Darnley was not just a royal scandal. It was a political event that rocked Europe. The circumstances surrounding his death were so mysterious that many believed Mary's involvement. Some even argued that Mary was involved because she was trying to free herself from a controlling husband who was proving to be too much of a liability. The reality is that this murder set off a chain of events that would lead to Mary's imprisonment in England. The final blow to Mary's reign came with her third marriage, to the Earl of Bothwell. This marriage was seen as the ultimate scandal, one that sealed her fate. Bothwell was the prime suspect in Darnley's murder, and by marrying him, Mary alienated much of her own court and the Scottish nobility. The marriage was considered not just scandalous, but politically disastrous. Many of Mary's allies turned against her, and she lost the support of the people. Her third marriage was seen as a reckless, impulsive act that demonstrated her inability to make rational political decisions. Now, here's the twist. While many viewed this marriage as the act that sealed her doom, there's an argument to be made that Mary had no choice but to marry Bothwell. After all, the political situation in Scotland was precarious, and Mary's enemies were closing in. The marriage, though unpopular, may have been her last-ditch attempt to secure her power, but the reality was that it further alienated her from the people she needed to support her. Mary's marriages were more than just love affairs. They were political gambles, each one sealing her fate further. Her first marriage gave her power, but it ended in loss. Her second marriage was filled with scandal and ended with murder. Her third marriage was politically disastrous and led to her downfall. But perhaps the most tragic part of all is that Mary, Queen of Scots, seemed unable to escape the political games that dominated her life. Every marriage she entered into was fraught with danger and potential betrayal, and each one pushed her closer to her eventual imprisonment and execution. Here's a controversial idea. Some historians argue that had Mary chosen to marry more wisely, or not at all, her fate might have been different. But her marriages were emblematic of the challenges challenges women in power faced during the Tudor era. In a world where royal marriages were political tools, Mary was forced to navigate treacherous waters. Her love life wasn't just a personal journey, it was a reflection of the harsh political realities of the time. So, what can we learn from Mary's marriages? Perhaps it's that power and love rarely mix well, especially when the stakes are so high. Mary's personal decisions became intertwined with her political fate, and the consequences of those decisions were dire. Her story is a cautionary tale about the dangers of making political decisions based on emotion and personal relationships. It reminds us that in the world of monarchy, every marriage carries immense risks, not just for the individuals involved, but for entire nations. What if I told you that Mary, Queen of Scots' very own supporters plotted against Elizabeth I to put Mary on the English throne? Most people think Mary was the victim of a series of unfortunate events, but the truth is far darker, and the Babington Plot is proof of this. In the late 16th century, religious and political tension between Catholics and Protestants was at its peak. Elizabeth I had firmly established herself as the Protestant monarch of England, but there were many who felt her reign was illegitimate given her Protestantism and the nature of her father Henry VIII's break with Rome. Mary, Queen of Scots, was not only a Catholic but also had a legitimate claim to the English throne as a descendant of Henry VII. This made her a figurehead for Catholics who were increasingly upset by Elizabeth's rule. Now, this is where it gets fascinating and somewhat controversial. It's widely believed that Mary herself was not directly behind the plot. But what if I told you that by being imprisoned in England, Mary's very existence became a rallying cry for the Catholic rebels? This tension built up over years, and in 1586 it came to a head in what's known as the Babington Plot, a Catholic conspiracy to assassinate Elizabeth and place Mary on the English throne. What most people don't realize is that Elizabeth's spies had been monitoring Mary for years, and in one of the most dramatic moments in history, they uncovered a secret letter from Mary implicating herself in the plot. Here's the thing that most don't know. Mary didn't directly order the assassination of Elizabeth. Instead, she exchanged letters with a group of Catholic conspirators, including a man named Anthony Babington, who had the plan to murder Elizabeth. They hoped to stage a coup that would put Mary on the throne. Elizabeth's network of spies intercepted these letters and uncovered the conspiracy, leading to one of the most pivotal moments in the history of their rivalry. Strange fact, the plot was uncovered by Elizabeth's Secret Service, led by Sir Francis Walsingham, who was so good at his job that many believe his network of spies helped keep Elizabeth safe from numerous assassination attempts. In fact, this was one of the first modern intelligence operations, and it was so efficient that Walsingham's network became the model for future intelligence services in England. This is where the drama truly intensifies. Once the plot was uncovered, Elizabeth was faced with a monumental decision. Should she execute Mary, the queen who had been imprisoned for 19 years in England, or should she let her go? Despite being a direct threat to Elizabeth's throne, many of her closest advisors urged caution, fearing that executing Mary could cause unrest among Catholics in Europe. But Mary had become too much of a symbol for the Catholic opposition, and her very existence seemed like a ticking time bomb. The fact that Mary was implicated in a plot to kill Elizabeth made the decision almost inevitable. But here's the twist. The execution of Mary, while it may have seemed like the right choice politically, had huge consequences. Mary's death didn't just end her claim to the throne. It also left a legacy of division within England. It marked the end of a long and bloody religious conflict between Catholics and Protestants, but it didn't settle the issue. Instead, the execution deepened the divide. Mary's involvement in the Babington Plot solidified her status as a direct threat to Elizabeth. The execution itself was a political necessity, but it left a trail of anger in Catholic Europe. In fact, Mary's death led to many Catholic plots against Elizabeth, and these plots only increased after her execution. Many in England, as well as across Europe, were furious about the killing of a queen. The Babington Plot was not just a personal rivalry, it was a political game of life and death. For Elizabeth, the stakes were high, and the cost of tolerating Mary's presence was greater than the cost of execution. But for Mary, her involvement in this plot led to a tragic end to her life, marking her as a martyr in the eyes of many Catholics. The irony? Mary was used by her supporters, driven to act in ways that would eventually cost her life. The lesson here is profound. This wasn't just about two queens fighting for power. It was about the deeper issues of religion, legitimacy, and the very soul of England. The Babington Plot exposed how intertwined political power and religion were, and how much the fate of these queens rested on their alliances and their enemies. In the next section, we'll dive deeper into how Mary's captivity and her long years in prison played into the political strategies of both Elizabeth and her enemies. This isn't just about two queens fighting. It's about the deadly game of politics they were forced to play, a game that continues to have lessons for us today. Stay tuned for more, because what happens next is even more shocking. Elizabeth I saw Mary, Queen of Scots, as a serious threat, not just a rival for the English throne, but as a pawn in a much larger game. After being imprisoned for nearly 19 years, Mary remained a figurehead for Catholic hopes and a symbol of rebellion against Elizabeth's Protestant rule. But what if I told you that despite her imprisonment, Mary was deeply involved in a plot that sought to end Elizabeth's reign once and for all? In 1586, Elizabeth's spies uncovered the Babington Plot, one of the most notorious Catholic conspiracies rivalries aimed at assassinating the Protestant queen. The plot itself was shocking, and its implications were even more dangerous. The conspirators, led by a man named Anthony Babington, were determined to place Mary on the English throne, believing that Elizabeth's reign was illegitimate due to her Protestant faith. But here's the twist. Mary was not just an innocent pawn in this dangerous game. She was directly involved in the plot through secret letters that were intercepted by Elizabeth's spy network. Most people believe Mary was too imprisoned and isolated to have had much influence, but the truth is that her very presence in England was a political weapon used by those who wanted to overthrow Elizabeth. And when Mary's letters were found, implicating her in the Babington Plot, it was a game-changer. Strange fact, Elizabeth's spy master, Sir Francis Walsingham, had a network of spies and informants that were so effective they were able to infiltrate Catholic circles and uncover these plots before they could unfold. His network was so extensive that many consider it to be one of the first modern intelligence operations in history, influencing how intelligence would be gathered and used in the centuries to come. Mary's involvement in the Babington Plot made her a direct threat to Elizabeth's throne. Many people would argue that Mary, already imprisoned, couldn't possibly have orchestrated such a thing. But the reality is, her role in the conspiracy was the catalyst that led to her tragic downfall. Elizabeth's government had little choice but to act. Once the plot was revealed, it became clear that Mary could not be allowed to live, not just because of her involvement in the assassination attempt, but because her survival symbolized the continued threat to Elizabeth's reign. But here's the bigger question. Was her execution truly inevitable? After the plot was uncovered, Elizabeth faced immense pressure to take drastic action. On one hand, executing a fellow queen was a deeply personal and politically fraught decision. On the other, Mary's death was seen as necessary to eliminate the Catholic threat once and for all. Elizabeth hesitated for months before finally signing the death warrant. This decision, as controversial as it was, proved to be a turning point in Elizabeth's reign. The execution of Mary sent shockwaves through Catholic Europe, and the repercussions were immediate. The death of Mary, far from ending the rivalry between the two queens, deepened the divide between Catholics and Protestants. But there's more to this story than just the execution. The Babington Plot wasn't the end of the rivalry. It was the moment it became more than just a personal feud. The ramifications of Elizabeth's decision would echo through history, influencing everything from international politics to the way monarchs dealt with threats. The intrigue behind the Babington Plot was a microcosm of the broader struggles of the time. Religion, power, and loyalty were all tangled up in a web that ultimately led to one of the most dramatic executions in British history. This wasn't just a rivalry between two queens. It was a battle for the very identity of England. What happened next is even more fascinating. The political fallout from Mary's execution led to new alliances, new threats, and even more conspiracies. Elizabeth may have survived this crisis, but she would never escape the shadow of Mary's legacy. In the next section, we'll explore how Mary's imprisonment influenced not only Elizabeth's rule, but also the way history remembers their rivalry. Keep watching, because the story of these two queens is far from over. Mary's imprisonment in England for 19 years wasn't just a simple matter of political containment. It was the stage for one of the most intense, high-stakes political struggles of the 16th century. Mary's continued presence in England was seen by many as a constant threat to Elizabeth's throne. But what if I told you that, despite being locked away, Mary was still a powerful political pawn, used both by her enemies and her supporters in ways Elizabeth could never fully control? Mary's captivity was not simply a holding period. Instead, it turned her into a living symbol for the Catholic cause, fueling resistance to Elizabeth's Protestant regime. She was held under strict guard, but even within the confines of her prison, she never gave up hope of reclaiming her throne. The question many ask is, why didn't Elizabeth just execute Mary immediately? Why allow this symbol of Catholic opposition to survive for so long? Mary's imprisonment was a constant reminder to Elizabeth that the struggle for power wasn't just between two queens. It was a religious, political, and dynastic fight that could shift at any moment. The longer Mary lived, the more she could influence Catholic plots within England and across Europe. The problem? Elizabeth's need to maintain the appearance of fairness and legitimacy. She didn't want to be seen as the queen who murdered another queen, especially when that queen had such widespread support in Catholic Europe. Strange fact, Mary was not only a prisoner in England, she became a symbol of martyrdom for Catholics throughout Europe. The Catholic nations, especially Spain and France, continuously pressured Elizabeth to either release or execute Mary. But releasing her would have meant giving the Catholic forces inside England a legitimate cause to rally behind. Keeping her imprisoned allowed Elizabeth to avoid directly alienating Catholic Europe, though she was constantly under pressure. While Mary remained in her captivity, Elizabeth's advisors were divided on what to do with her. Some urged Elizabeth to execute Mary to permanently neutralize the threat. Others worried that such a drastic move could spark a rebellion or even foreign intervention. Elizabeth's struggle was not just political, it was deeply personal. She didn't want to be the monarch who executed a fellow queen, particularly one who had once been a fellow royal. But as time passed, the pressure to act grew unbearable. But here's the twist. Mary, though held in captivity, was still deeply involved in plots against Elizabeth. Elizabeth's spies uncovered this plot through intercepted letters between Mary and the conspirators, which ultimately led to Mary's execution. The complexity of this situation can't be understated. The very woman Elizabeth kept alive in order to avoid political fallout ended up being the catalyst for her execution. Many people think Mary's execution was a clear-cut decision, but the reality is far more complicated. Elizabeth had the opportunity to eliminate Mary earlier, but instead, she kept her alive as a political symbol. It was only when Mary's direct involvement in the Babington Plot was uncovered that Elizabeth's hand was forced. Mary's death was not just the end of her claim to the throne, it was also a symbol of the lengths Elizabeth was willing to go to preserve her power. What's fascinating about this entire scenario is that Elizabeth's decision to imprison Mary ultimately gave Mary more political power than she would have had if she had simply been executed. While Elizabeth thought she was keeping control, she inadvertently allowed Mary to remain a symbol for Catholic rebellion. The execution of Mary, while ending the immediate threat, ignited further religious and political tension, deepening the divide between Catholics and Protestants in England. The legacy of their rivalry, even after Mary's death, lived on, with Elizabeth forever haunted by the decisions she had made. Mary's captivity and the political intrigue surrounding her became a reminder of the fine line Elizabeth had to walk between strength and compassion. As the years passed, the tension between the two queens only intensified, and every decision Elizabeth made was scrutinized, whether it was the choice to imprison Mary or later to have her executed. The rivalry wasn't just a battle for a throne, it was a battle for the future of England itself, and the personal costs for Elizabeth were incredibly high. Stay tuned, because we're about to dive deeper into how international politics played a role in this rivalry. Elizabeth wasn't just battling Mary for the throne, she was navigating a complex geopolitical landscape where the fate of England depended on the alliances and the enemies she could secure on the international stage. This is where the story takes an even more dramatic turn, and the real stakes of the rivalry between Elizabeth and Mary come into focus. You won't want to miss how these queens became pawns in a much larger game. Elizabeth's advisors, particularly Sir Francis Walsingham, played a key role in shaping the outcome of the rivalry with Mary. Walsingham's talents in espionage became the stuff of legends. He was, in many ways, the architect of Elizabeth's political survival. But here's a question that might surprise you. Were Elizabeth and Mary truly in control of their own fates, or were they both being manipulated by their advisors, who had their own agendas? Both queens had a network of advisors, but it's clear that these advisors held a significant amount of power in influencing their decisions. While Elizabeth's advisors often acted in her best interests, their methods were sometimes ruthless. Sir Francis Walsingham, for instance, was a key figure in thwarting numerous plots against Elizabeth, including the Babington Plot, which directly involved Mary. Walsingham's network of spies intercepted letters between Mary and her conspirators, revealing that Mary had given her approval to assassinate Elizabeth. This plot was the catalyst that led to Mary's eventual execution, but what's less often discussed is how much Walsingham's personal ambition played into these decisions. Strange fact, Walsingham's methods were so effective that some believed he had nearly as much power as the Queen herself. Elizabeth's dependence on him was almost total. He was her eyes and ears in the most secret corners of her kingdom. He played a major role in turning Mary's captivity into an ongoing political and diplomatic crisis for Elizabeth. Yet, despite Walsingham's successes, his aggressive pursuit of Mary's downfall would ultimately have tragic consequences for both queens. But here's the twist. While Walsingham had the best interests of Elizabeth at heart, not all of her advisors were as straightforward. Some advisors, like Robert Dudley and William Cecil, had their own ambitions, and their motivations were often entangled with the larger political games being played across Europe. It was these personal ambitions, combined with the religious and dynastic struggles, that made the rivalry between the two queens so much more complicated than it seemed. Many believe that Elizabeth was the sole ruler of England, but in reality, her reign was heavily influenced by the political scheming and power plays of these key advisors. In some ways, both queens were pawns in a much larger game, manipulated by those around them. For Elizabeth, her control over Mary more than a matter of security. It was about maintaining her own power and protecting England from what was perceived as a direct threat from Catholic Europe. Mary, on the other hand, was being used by the Spanish and the Catholic powers in Europe as a figurehead, a symbol for their resistance against Elizabeth's Protestant rule. The most controversial point here is that both Elizabeth and Mary, despite being monarchs, had limited autonomy. Their choices were shaped, often, by the powerful figures who surrounded them. Elizabeth may have seemed like a master strategist, but it was her advisors, with their intricate webs of manipulation, who truly determined the course of events. This opens up an important question. How much control do leaders really have over the events that define their reigns? Were they truly in charge, or were they merely reacting to the ambitions of those behind the scenes? This leads us to a rare fact about Tudor politics. Much of what we think of as Elizabeth's genius was, in fact, the result of a collaborative effort, an effort led by those who were often far more ruthless than the Queen herself. While Elizabeth's decision to execute Mary might seem like the culmination of a straightforward power struggle, it was, in reality, the result of years of political maneuvering by advisors like Walsingham and others who knew how to exploit international tensions for their own ends. It was a game of chess, with the queens as mere pieces. But this raises a deeper question about leadership and manipulation. What does it say about a monarchy when the fate of two queens is decided not just by their actions, but by the shadows of those behind them. It's a stark reminder of the unseen forces at play in historical events, and how easily history can be shaped by those who stay in the background. Stay tuned, because we're about to dive into the symbolism of Elizabeth and Mary's rivalry, exploring how their personal battles reflected a larger cultural and religious struggle. We're not just talking about two women vying for the throne, we're talking about a fight for the very soul of England, one that would change the course of history. Their rivalry was not just a political battle, it became a symbol of the fight for the very soul of England. Elizabeth and Mary, Queen of Scots, represented two conflicting forces that would shape the future of the British Isles for centuries. The true stakes of their battle were about much more than power. The outcome of their rivalry would determine the religious and cultural trajectory of England, and by extension, Europe. Now, you might think that it was all about the throne and who would wear the crown, but what if I told you that the true battle was over the future of England itself? The split between Catholicism and Protestantism had already caused bloodshed and turmoil across Europe, and England was no exception. Elizabeth's rise to power had already set her on a collision course with Catholic factions who believed Mary, a Catholic queen, should be the rightful ruler of England. The idea of Mary ascending the English throne was a spark that fueled political and religious tensions not just in England but throughout Europe. Let's break this down. What was really at stake here was control over the direction of a nation. Elizabeth's reign was rooted in the Protestant Reformation, while Mary's legitimacy as queen was supported by Catholic Europe, which made her a figurehead for Catholics in England. This clash of ideologies, Protestantism versus Catholicism, was at the heart of their rivalry, and it wasn't just about the two women. It was a larger cultural and religious battle that would shape generations to come. Here's where things get interesting. Elizabeth, despite her political genius, had a fragile throne. Every decision she made, from her refusal to marry to her treatment of Mary, had massive implications, not just for her own reign, but for the future of the English monarchy. The question of succession, the question of religion, and the question of legitimacy were all intertwined. In fact, the relationship between Elizabeth and Mary was defined by the symbolic battle between Protestantism and Catholicism. Elizabeth became the embodiment of Protestant England, while Mary symbolized Catholic England's struggle to reclaim the throne. But here's a little-known fact. The role religion played in their rivalry wasn't just a matter of personal belief. It was a matter of survival for both queens. Elizabeth's refusal to marry, famously positioning herself as the Virgin Queen, was a political move. She feared that marrying the wrong man could give away too much power, and any Catholic suitor would be seen as a potential threat to Protestant England. This decision made her vulnerable, but also made her the symbol of Protestant rule. However, Mary's Catholic sympathies made her the darling of Catholic factions and the enemy of Protestant England. It's fascinating to consider how both queens, despite their different faiths, were tied to the religious divides that would fuel their rivalry. But let's shift gears here and talk about how this wasn't just a personal feud. This was also a fight for international influence. Spain, the largest Catholic power in Europe, supported Mary's claim to the English throne. Meanwhile, France, once an ally of Mary's, became increasingly hostile to Elizabeth's reign. For Elizabeth, her decisions were not just based on personal animosity toward Mary. She was playing a high-stakes game in a volatile geopolitical climate. Every move she made, from dealing with Spain's backing of Mary to managing France's shifting alliances, was influenced by these international pressures. Now, consider this. These advisors, like Sir Francis Walsingham for Elizabeth, were not just political aides. They were masterminds of espionage and diplomacy, manipulating the threads of the rivalry for their own gain. For Elizabeth, Walsingham's efforts were crucial in keeping her on the throne. His intelligence network played a key role in keeping Elizabeth safe and ultimately revealing plots like the Babington Plot, which aimed to place Mary on the throne. Here's where things get really intriguing. Elizabeth's advisors often operated in the shadows, making decisions that shaped the course of history. These advisors, more than the queens themselves at times, played a central role in determining the direction of their rivalry. Walsingham and his contemporaries had far-reaching influence, shaping public perception and even orchestrating the downfall of Mary. This wasn't a battle between two women alone. It was a fight for control over the future of England and, by extension, the future of European politics. During hours, inutile cups, agodiers, and parade, and great figure, rule. However, the truth is that both queens were often at the mercy of their advisors, who were the real power players behind the scenes. The rivalry also became a cultural symbol of the larger political divide between Protestant and Catholic forces. Elizabeth represented the rise of Protestantism, while Mary symbolized the Catholic claim to the throne. This conflict over the soul of England was reflected in the policies they enacted, the alliances they formed, and ultimately in the way their stories were remembered. Their rivalry became the epitome of religious and political struggle, a symbol of the divide that would continue to shape England's future long after they were both gone. As we move forward, we'll explore the fascinating details of their rivalry and how it wasn't just about power, it was about survival, of their reigns, their legacies, and their very idea. In the next sections, we'll dive deeper into how their personal decisions, like Mary's marriages and Elizabeth's stance on marriage, were just the surface of a much bigger and more dangerous political game. Their rivalry left an indelible mark on history, shaping not only the future of England but also setting the stage for the next chapter in European politics. But what was the lasting impact of this conflict? Was it the death of Mary that ended the tension, or did it merely shift the power dynamic in ways that would have unforeseen consequences? We'll find out, but for now, remember, Elizabeth and Mary weren't just queens fighting for the throne. They were symbols of two worlds on the brink of massive change. Was Mary's death the only way out for Elizabeth's? It's a question that lingered for years, and the answer isn't as simple as it might seem. For Elizabeth, the decision to execute her cousin, Mary, Queen of Scots, was it wasn't just about the throne. It was about the very survival of her reign, and in many ways, the survival of the Protestant faith in England. Mary's execution was the culmination of years of political intrigue, religious tension, and royal maneuvering. But was it inevitable? After all, Elizabeth had hesitated for months before signing the death warrant for her cousin. She was aware that executing Mary would solidify her hold on the throne, but it would also alienate many Catholic factions, including those in Europe who had long supported Mary's claim to the English throne. Yet every moment Elizabeth delayed her decision made her more vulnerable to conspiracy and rebellion. The situation was more than just a political dilemma. It was a battle for England's soul. For Elizabeth, the very idea of executing Mary was an admission of how fragile her rule had become. She knew that if she didn't take action, Mary's supporters, bolstered by Spain and other Catholic powers, could continue to challenge her reign. But at the same time, Mary's execution would cost Elizabeth any remaining hope of reconciliation with Catholic Europe. And let's not forget, executing a queen, even one as controversial as Mary, was a monumental decision. It wasn't simply a matter of removing a rival. It was a public declaration of the religious and political direction that Elizabeth intended to lead England in. The Babington Plot, Mary's involvement in a Catholic conspiracy to assassinate Elizabeth, was the final catalyst. When Elizabeth's spies uncovered the plot, they knew it wasn't just a threat to her life. It was a direct challenge to the Protestant future of England. Many believed that Mary, if crowned, would undo everything Elizabeth had fought for. But the question remained, was executing Mary the only way forward? Could Elizabeth have avoided such an irreversible act? Here's something that might surprise you. While many view Elizabeth's actions as a ruthless political move, the execution of Mary wasn't as widely supported as it might seem. In fact, the execution was incredibly divisive even within Elizabeth's own court. Her advisors were split, some advocating for Mary's death as a means to secure the throne, while others warned of the long-term consequences of such an action. And don't forget, Elizabeth was walking a tightrope. Every decision she made could either ensure her reign or lead to her downfall. Her decision to execute Mary was not taken lightly, but it also became a defining moment for her legacy. But what did this act mean for the future? After Mary's execution, Elizabeth's position was strengthened in some ways but made much more precarious in others. Though the death of Mary ended the immediate threat to her throne, it also sparked uprisings and conspiracies that would plague her for the remainder of her reign. Her decision, though politically necessary, exposed the harsh realities of leadership and the limits of royal power. Elizabeth's rule had become a balancing act, one where survival often came at the cost of moral and diplomatic compromise. The execution of Mary did not end the tension between the Protestant and Catholic factions in England. It only fueled the fire. For Catholics, Mary's death was a martyrdom, a symbol of the brutal repression they faced under Elizabeth's rule. For Protestants, it was a victory, a confirmation that their queen was steadfast in her commitment to their cause. But what is often overlooked is the price Elizabeth paid in personal terms. Her image as a strong ruler was tarnished by the execution of a fellow queen, and no matter how much she tried to project power, the shadow of that decision haunted her for the rest of her life. Now, let's delve into the aftermath. What did the execution of Mary mean for Elizabeth's legacy? On one hand, it confirmed Elizabeth's control over the English throne and ensured the Protestant succession. But on the other hand, it left her isolated in a Europe that was becoming more and more divided by religious warfare. The political ramifications of her decision were far-reaching, affecting not just England's relationship with Catholic Europe, but also the very fabric of English society. For years, the execution of Mary would continue to be a contentious topic, and Elizabeth's reign would be shaped by this moment of political necessity. But let's step back for a moment and think about the bigger picture. The rivalry between Elizabeth and Mary wasn't just about these two queens. It was a struggle for England's future, a struggle that would define the nation for generations to come. Now, the decision to execute Mary wasn't just a personal or political one. It was a statement about the direction of the English monarchy, about the role of religion in politics, and about the lengths a ruler must go to in order to maintain control in a turbulent world. As we reflect on this chapter of history, we begin to understand the true complexity of leaderships. Elizabeth's actions, though often viewed as politically calculated, were also shaped by her understanding of the precarious nature of power. In the end, Elizabeth had to make a choice: safeguard her reign and the Protestant future of England at all costs, or risk her kingdom's stability by allowing a Catholic rival to continue to loom over her. Her decision to execute Mary was the ultimate act of political survival, and while it may have secured her position in the short term, it also set the stage for future conflict and division. Mary's execution was, in many ways, the final chapter in their rivalry, but it wasn't the end of the story. The legacy of this dramatic moment would resonate for years years to come, influencing the politics of England, the dynamics of royal power, and the relationship between Protestant and Catholic nations. As we look back on their rivalry, we're reminded that the price of power is often steep, and the decisions made by those in power can have consequences that echo through history. In the next section, we'll take a closer look at how Elizabeth's decision impacted her reign, the political landscape of England, and the legacy of her rule. Stay tuned, because the true consequences of Mary's death weren't just political, they were cultural, religious, and personal. The fallout from that moment would affect not just Elizabeth, but the entire course of English history. Elizabeth's victory over Mary did not bring her the lasting peace that many would have expected. Instead, the execution left her isolated, both within England and on the world stage. As a Protestant queen ruling in a predominantly Catholic world, Elizabeth had already been walking a tightrope, balancing the demands of her supporters with the ever-present threat of rebellion. But after Mary's execution, that balance became even harder to maintain. One of the key outcomes of Mary's death was the solidification of Elizabeth's power within England, but it also made her vulnerable to the intense backlash from Catholic factions both at home and abroad. The Spanish, in particular, saw her as a usurper, someone who had executed a legitimate Catholic queen in cold blood. It was a dangerous game for Elizabeth to play, and the consequences of her decision rippled through European politics. Her own supporters, though thrilled by the political victory, also grew increasingly uncomfortable with the idea of a ruler who had executed a fellow monarch. It wasn't just a matter of political maneuvering anymore. It was about the morality of the act. The decision left Elizabeth walking a fine line. Any further misstep could cause a revolt, either from the Catholic factions or from the rising Protestant extremists who saw her as weak for not executing Mary earlier. Mary's execution, while silencing a major threat to Elizabeth's rule, did not immediately end the religious tensions in England. Far from it, the division between Catholics and Protestants was only heightened by the event. Catholics viewed Mary as a martyr, someone who died for the faith, while Protestants saw her execution as a triumph of their cause. This clash of ideologies set the stage for years of political strife. In addition to the internal strife, Elizabeth's foreign relations were heavily influenced by the aftermath of Mary's death. Her actions prompted retaliatory threats from Catholic Europe, most notably Spain. King Philip II of Spain, in particular, who had already been considering an invasion of England, now found renewed justification for a military response. He even began to gather a fleet, the famous Spanish Armada, that would later attempt to overthrow Elizabeth in what is one of the most dramatic chapters of English history. But the ramifications of Mary's execution were not only political or religious, they were deeply personal for Elizabeth. In a way, it marked a loss of innocence for the Queen. She had always prided herself on being the Virgin Queen, untouched by the scandals and ambitions that usually plagued the royal family. Yet, in this moment, her decision to execute Mary irrevocably changed her image. She was no longer just a ruler playing the political game. She had crossed a line that many felt could not be undone. As time wore on, Elizabeth's power continued to grow, but it was tainted by this lingering shadow. Her enemies used the execution as a rallying point against her, while her supporters were forced to defend her decision, even when they knew it had cost England dearly. In many ways, the execution of Mary haunted Elizabeth for the rest of her reign. Even though her position was secure, the political and moral consequences of that moment continued to reverberate through her rule. Ultimately, Mary's death did not end the tension between Catholics and Protestants. It only sharpened it, and in the years that followed, England would continue to face the threat of internal rebellion and foreign invasion. Elizabeth's reign, though long and marked by many triumphs, was always overshadowed by the dramatic and controversial execution of her cousin. In a way, that single act set the course for the rest of her life and the life of England. As we reflect on the aftershocks of Mary's execution, we're reminded that decisions made by leaders are never just about the immediate effects. Every choice carries with it a complex web of consequences, some of which are only felt years, even centuries later. Mary's death didn't just shape the future of England, it reshaped the future of Europe. It was a decision that would reverberate through history, leaving a legacy that no one could escape. Now, as we continue to examine the lasting effects of this rivalry, we turn our attention to the broader impact on England, its political culture, and its relationship with the rest of Europe. We'll explore how Elizabeth's leadership, shaped by Mary's execution, defined the course of English history in the years to come. Stay tuned, because the true consequences of Mary's death were more far-reaching than anyone could have predicted. Elizabeth and Mary's rivalry wasn't just about two queens fighting for the throne. It was about their respective roles in a larger battle for the soul of England. The political, religious, and cultural tension between these two women had far-reaching consequences, not only for the future of England, but for the whole of Europe. Their fight was not one they chose, but one that was thrust upon them by the very forces they sought to control. But the question remains, was Mary's execution the only way forward for Elizabeth? And if so, what did that decision cost her and England? For months, Elizabeth hesitated. Executing a queen, a fellow monarch, was not something she took lightly. The repercussions of such an act were monumental, both within England and abroad. There were political factions on both sides of the religious divide that pressured her, some calling for Mary's death, others urging mercy. Elizabeth, ever the master of political calculation, understood the gravity of her choice. Yet, after years years of political maneuvering and Mary's involvement in the Babington Plot, Elizabeth faced the bitter reality that she could no longer afford to let Mary live. But did the execution truly bring peace? In some ways, it did. It ended the immediate threat to Elizabeth's reign and removed a symbol of Catholic rebellion. But it also sparked a new wave of unrest. The Catholic powers in Europe, particularly Spain, saw Mary's death as an affront to their faith and a direct challenge to the legitimacy of Elizabeth's rule. Philip II of Spain, already angered by Elizabeth's support of Protestantism, found in Mary's execution the justification for further action, and that action would lead to one of the most dramatic military confrontations in English history, the Spanish Armada. For Elizabeth, the execution of Mary wasn't just a political move, it was a personal one. Her decision to sign Mary's death warrant solidified her power, but it also forced her to face the dark side of leadership. The reality of ruling in such a volatile time meant making decisions that were not just political, but deeply moral. Elizabeth had always been known for her strategic mind, but this decision tested her resolve like never before. The execution itself was the culmination of years of plotting and counterplotting, and it was a decisive moment in the history of the English throne. Yet, in the aftermath, Elizabeth found herself more isolated than ever. The rift between Catholic and Protestant factions deepened, and the legacy of Mary's death would haunt Elizabeth for the rest of her life. As much as she tried to present herself as the Virgin Queen, untouched by scandal, the shadow of Mary's execution would always be part of her reign. And then there was the matter of England's future. With Mary's death, Elizabeth had not only secured her throne, but also set the stage for a new era in English politics. Elizabeth's hold on power was far from certain, and the fear of rebellion loomed large. The idea of monarchy as divinely ordained was still a powerful force, and Elizabeth's decision to execute a fellow queen sent ripples throughout Europe that would not soon be forgotten. In the years that followed, Elizabeth would face new threats from within and beyond her kingdom. The Protestant Reformation was far from over, and tensions within her own court continued to rise. Yet despite these challenges, Elizabeth would emerge as one of England's greatest monarchs. The execution of Mary, while controversial, played a crucial role in shaping the path Elizabeth would take, securing her reign for years to come. But even in victory, Elizabeth faced a personal cost. As much as she tried to present herself as a strong and unyielding ruler, the moral weight of Mary's death would remain a burden, and that burden would stay with her until the end of her life. The execution of Mary, though necessary from a political standpoint, ultimately revealed the complexities of ruling in such turbulent times. As we look back on this pivotal moment in history, we see not just a story of political maneuvering, but a story of personal sacrifice and moral compromise. Elizabeth's decision to execute Mary was not just a political calculation. It was a reflection of the complex and often painful nature of leadership. It reminds us that even the most powerful rulers must make choices that come at great personal cost. In the end, it's not just about the throne, it's about the legacy left behind, and the price paid for that legacy. The consequences of Mary's death rippled through England, through Europe, and through history. Elizabeth's reign would be defined by this moment, but it also marked the beginning of the end of the Tudor dynasty. The struggle for power, for legitimacy, and for control would continue to shape England's future long after Elizabeth's death. As we look at the broader implications of Elizabeth's decision, we realize that history is not just a series of events, it's a web of decisions, each one affecting the next. The execution of Mary was a critical turning point, but it was only one chapter in a much larger story. The true impact of that decision can be seen not only in the immediate aftermath, but in the generations that followed. Elizabeth and Mary's rivalry was more than just a battle for the throne. It became a symbol of deeper forces at work in England. But what exactly shaped how the public viewed these two queens? Both women were constantly judged, not just for their political decisions, but for their gender. In a world mostly dominated by men, the power and authority of both Elizabeth and Mary were often questioned simply because they were women. Their struggles to maintain control in such a patriarchal society revealed the complexities of gender and power that extend far beyond the walls of their royal courts. Elizabeth, known as the Virgin Queen, was admired for her political astuteness, stability, and ability to navigate the intricate world of court politics. Her image was carefully crafted, portraying her as a strong, independent ruler who could not be swayed by the demands of a husband or consort. She remained unmarried, asserting her power not just in her reign, but in her very identity as a woman who refused to bow to the conventional expectations of marriage. But in the eyes of some, her refusal to marry marked her as a political and personal failure. Critics saw her as a woman who feared losing control, who prioritized power over love. In contrast, Mary was often seen as a tragic figure, romanticized by many as the victim of her tumultuous marriages and eventual downfall. While Elizabeth portrayed herself as the ruler of a progressive Protestant England, Mary embodied the Catholic past, and her life was a reminder of England's more turbulent religious history. The stark contrast between these two women became a battleground not just for the throne, but for the very soul of the nation. Both queens used their images to gain power, but their efforts were received differently. Elizabeth's political savvy made her a powerful icon for Protestant England, but Mary's image was shaped by tragedy. She was romanticized, seen by some as a victim of circumstance, and by others as the rightful queen who had been dethroned and imprisoned unjustly. This image was perpetuated by by Mary's supporters and the Catholic factions who saw her as a martyr. Propaganda from both sides played a crucial role in shaping how the public saw these queens, and as much as Elizabeth tried to control her image, Mary's romanticized portrayal often made her seem like a figure who deserved sympathy and respect. Elizabeth's advisors, such as Sir Francis Walsingham, skillfully used propaganda to bolster her legitimacy, making her the symbol of a strong, stable England in a time of religious strife. On the other hand, Mary's advisors, though far less competent, tried to craft an image of Mary as the rightful Catholic monarch, one who had been betrayed by those closest to her. This clash of images would ultimately have far-reaching consequences. Elizabeth's calculated efforts to maintain her image as the Virgin Queen contributed significantly to her popularity, but it also left her vulnerable to attacks from those who saw her refusal to marry as a sign of weakness. The public perception of these two queens was critical in shaping the political landscape of the time. Elizabeth's image was a tool used to unite her people under the banner of Protestantism, but it also alienated many Catholics who felt betrayed by her refusal to acknowledge their religious authority. Mary, on the other hand, became the figurehead for those who resisted Protestantism, serving as a reminder of the old Catholic order that many still longed for. This division, fueled by propaganda, heightened the rivalry between the two queens, making it not just a personal matter, but a religious and political battle for the future of England. Tension between these two queens, and the way their public images were manipulated, shows us how power was not just about military might or strategic alliances. It was about perception, the ability to control how you were seen and how your enemies were portrayed. Elizabeth and Mary may have been rivals for the throne, but their struggle for control of the narrative was just as important, if not more so, than their political battles. Their images became symbols of the larger forces at play in Tudor England: the clash of religions, the tension between monarchy and the people, and the struggles of women in positions of power. The rivalry between Elizabeth and Mary is a story that goes beyond politics. It is a tale of two women whose destinies were shaped by not just the men around them, but the public's perception of them as rulers. The struggles they faced, the sacrifices they made, and the ways they navigated the complex world of court politics reveal much about the challenges women in power have always faced. Elizabeth and Mary may have been queens, but in the end, they were both women struggling to retain control in a world that did not see them as equals. The rivalry between Elizabeth I and Mary, Queen of Scots, did not end with the execution of Mary. It left a legacy of division that would echo for generations. Their personal feud set the stage for centuries of political and religious struggles, with each of them symbolizing the Great Divide in England: Catholicism versus Protestantism. Mary's execution didn't just resolve the conflict between the two queens. It deepened the divide in England, creating lasting tension between the Catholic and Protestant factions. Elizabeth's triumph over Mary was a victory for the Protestant cause, but it came at a high cost. By eliminating Mary as a threat, Elizabeth may have gained political power, but she also heightened the animosity of Catholic Europe, particularly Spain. Elizabeth's reign, which was already marked by religious and political struggles, would continue to face internal unrest from both sides. Despite her victory, Elizabeth was never fully free from the consequences of Mary's death. The execution acted as a catalyst, solidifying England's position as a Protestant nation, but simultaneously making Elizabeth a target for Catholic plots. Her decision to execute Mary alienated Catholic supporters both within and outside of England, and while it ended the immediate threat of a Catholic monarch on the English throne, it did not end the larger struggle for religious dominance in Europe. The lingering effects of this rivalry played out over the next few decades. After Mary's death, Catholic plots continued to threaten Elizabeth's reign, with notable events such as the Spanish Armada in 1588, which was aimed at dethroning her and restoring Catholicism in England. In the years following the execution, England's religious and political landscape would be shaped by Mary's martyrdom in Catholic eyes. She became a symbol of Catholic resistance, and her death, far from silencing her supporters, fueled further rebellion. The legacy of this rivalry did not just affect Elizabeth's immediate political landscape, it shaped the course of English history for centuries to come. The tension between Catholics and Protestants persisted long after Elizabeth's reign. Religious conflicts, particularly between Catholics and Protestants, would continue to be a source of unrest and division in England, leading to events like the English Civil War in the 17th century. Even as Elizabeth succeeded in maintaining her throne and creating a powerful England, the unresolved tensions from her rivalry with Mary would be a constant undercurrent throughout the next chapter of English history. Beyond the religious division, Elizabeth's later years were marked by a sense of isolation. While she had outlasted many rivals, including Mary, and secured her reign, she found herself increasingly isolated from many of her allies. By this time, Elizabeth was no longer the young and energetic queen she once was. Her reign had been characterized by brilliant military victories, such as the defeat of the Spanish Armada, but by her later years, Elizabeth faced personal and political challenges. Her inability to marry had been a major point of contention during her earlier reign, but by the end of her life, it had become a symbol of her political independence. Yet this independence also left her lonely and vulnerable, without a clear successor to carry on her legacy. Her political isolation, however, did not diminish her legacy. Elizabeth left a lasting mark on England, not only through her military triumphs, but through through her ability to maintain stability in a divided nation. She passed down an England that was Protestant, powerful and secure, even if that power came with its own set of long-lasting divisions. As we look at the historical impact of their rivalry, we see two queens locked in a battle not just for the throne but for the very future of England. Their feud was a pivotal moment in the history of the Tudor dynasty, and its consequences were felt far beyond the end of their reigns. Even today we continue to study their rivalry because it represents more than just a personal conflict. It's a symbol of the eternal struggle for power, religious supremacy, and the fight for control over a nation's destiny. Ultimately, the rivalry between Elizabeth I and Mary, Queen of Scots, did not just shape their own time. It left a legacy of division that echoed throughout English history, influencing the political and religious landscape for centuries to come. Their rivalry reminds us that the outcomes of history are often determined not just by the victors but by the long-lasting effects of their decisions. Decisions that continue to shape our understanding of power, politics, and the complex forces of religion and identity. Elizabeth's final years are often overshadowed by the myth of the Virgin Queen, but they were a period of survival, political savvy, and eventual triumph. After decades of conflict, including the infamous rivalry with Mary, Queen of Scots, Elizabeth found herself not just surviving, but increasingly becoming a symbol of England's resilience and strength. Yet despite this veneer of power, her reign was marked by struggles that would continue to shape the course of English history for generations. By the time Elizabeth entered her later years, the complexities of her reign had intensified. The earlier youthful era of military victories like the defeat of the Spanish Armada had given way to personal, political, and military challenges. Her enemies had evolved from rivals like Mary to factions within her own kingdom, as the tensions between Catholics and Protestants never truly subsided. These internal divides would continue to test Elizabeth's power to hold the kingdom together. However, it's important to note that Elizabeth never truly relinquished control. Despite personal setbacks, including the death of her most trusted advisors and an increasingly frail physical state, Elizabeth remained sharp. She used her perceived vulnerability to her advantage, often making strategic decisions that kept her adversaries at bay. But these moves came with a heavy cost, and her isolation grew as she struggled to find her place within the rapidly changing world around her. The myth of Elizabeth as the Virgin Queen, while empowering in its own right, also became a heavy burden. By this point in her reign, the idea of her marriage had become a distant dream for some of her most loyal subjects. The prospect of an heir was becoming more urgent as her age advanced. Yet Elizabeth refused to marry for reasons that were as much political as they were personal. She feared losing control to a foreign prince, something she had seen her father, Henry VIII, struggle with in his own marriages. Each suitor was viewed as a potential threat to her independence, which led to what some considered a form of political celibacy that left her increasingly isolated. At the same time, Elizabeth faced the threat of an emerging Catholic monarch. Spain had long seen Elizabeth as a heretic, and after the execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, her reputation as a Protestant icon was cemented. This external threat added to the tension of Elizabeth's later years, creating a political climate that was as precarious as it was dangerous. Despite the external threats, Elizabeth's internal strength was evident. She had spent her entire reign maneuvering between political, personal, and religious pressures, and the strategic decisions she made in her final years cemented her legacy as one of the greatest monarchs in English history. She reigned over an England that was increasingly prosperous. Despite the constant threats and uncertainty, England was not only surviving but thriving in the aftermath of decades of religious strife and wars. However, Elizabeth's health was undeniably failing. The once vibrant queen was no longer the dynamic ruler of her early years. By 1603, Elizabeth was physically frail, and her body began to show signs of the years of stress and hard work. Though her advisors had long been preparing for the inevitable transition to a new monarch, the queen's health was a reminder of the fragility of power. Yet, in a final act of defiance, Elizabeth held on until the very end, refusing to let go of the reins until she had ensured the stability of her throne. The most significant event of her later years, however, was her eventual death. Elizabeth passed away in 1603, the last of the Tudor dynasty. Her death marked the end of an era defined by a woman who had, against all odds, led a nation to greatness. The England she left behind was unrecognizable from the one she had inherited. Her legacy was not simply one of political acumen, but of a profound national identity that she had forged through her own leadership. Her death also marked the beginning of the Stuart dynasty, with James VI of Scotland ascending the throne as James I of England, uniting the crowns of England and Scotland for the first time. Elizabeth's legacy, however, lived on, deeply embedded in the English identity and history. The stability she had created with such calculated maneuvers would carry forward, setting the stage for England's eventual rise as a world power in the centuries that followed. Elizabeth's final years proved that the battle for survival was not just about external threats, but about maintaining control over her kingdom in a changing world. By navigating the internal conflicts, managing religious divisions, and facing her own mortality, Elizabeth showed the true nature of leadership. Her death marked the end of a tumultuous chapter in English history, but the mark she left on the world would shape the course of English destiny for centuries to come. In the end, Elizabeth Elizabeth's final years were about surviving the pressures of time, politics, and her own legacy. They were a reminder that the greatest rulers are not only those who conquer, but those who can weather the storm and emerge victorious on the other side. And in Elizabeth's case, her reign didn't just end with her death. It lived on in the world she helped create, a world shaped by the complexities and contradictions of her leadership. The story of Elizabeth and Mary, Queen of Scots, has captivated the world for centuries. It's a tale of power, ambition, betrayal, and most of all, a rivalry that transcended their personal animosity and became a symbol of England's political and religious divisions. But what is it about their relationship that continues to fascinate us to this day? Is it simply the drama of two queens fighting for the throne? Or is there something deeper, something that continues to echo through the centuries? While their rivalry is often reduced to a conflict between two queens, the truth is much more complex. Their lives, their decisions, and their struggles weren't just about securing a throne. They were also about their roles as women in a male-dominated world. Elizabeth and Mary navigated a world that was often hostile to women in power, yet they each carved out remarkable reigns, with power and influence that were remarkable for their time. But their gender wasn't the only factor that shaped their relationship. Politics, religion, and ambition were the true forces behind their rivalry. The fact that Elizabeth and Mary were both queens, each with a legitimate claim to the English throne, created an immediate tension. Elizabeth, as the daughter of Henry VIII, had spent much of her life defending her legitimacy. Mary, on the other hand, descended directly from Henry V's daughter, which made her a serious contender in the eyes of many Catholics who saw Elizabeth's Protestant reign as illegitimate. The battle for the throne was not just a matter of personal rivalry, it was a clash of dynasties, a battle for the soul of England itself. This religious divide only deepened the rivalry. Elizabeth, a Protestant, became the figurehead of the Protestant Reformation in England. Mary, a devout Catholic, became the leader of the Catholic opposition. To the Catholics in England and across Europe, Mary represented the rightful heir to the throne, and many saw Elizabeth as a heretic. This division fueled plots, conspiracies, and rebellions, each one more dangerous than the last, as both queens had factions within England that would do anything to see their monarch on the throne. But it wasn't just politics that defined their rivalry. Elizabeth's refusal to marry, maintaining her image as the Virgin Queen, became a central aspect of her reign. Many of her suitors had political motives, and her decision not to marry allowed her to keep her power within her own hands. For Mary, marriage was not just a personal decision, it was a tool for survival. Her marriages were politically charged and controversial, and the chaos surrounding her marriages would ultimately contribute to her downfall. As the rivalry escalated, it became more than just a battle for the throne. It was a battle for the future of England itself. But despite the stakes, one of the most shocking turns in their relationship was the eventual execution of Mary. Elizabeth, who had long considered Mary a threat, ultimately signed the death warrant for her cousin. It was a decision that would haunt Elizabeth for the rest of her life. In the aftermath of Mary's execution, Elizabeth's reign was marked by both triumphs and struggles. While she solidified her position as queen, the legacy of her rivalry with Mary remained. It wasn't just a rivalry between two women, it was a legacy that shaped the future of England, defining the country's politics, religion, and identity for generations to come. What's fascinating about their rivalry is that it's not just about the political decisions they made, it's about how the world saw them. How did their gender, their relationships, and their decisions as queens impact their legacies? And why does this rivalry still capture our imagination today? The story of Elizabeth and Mary is timeless, and the lessons we can learn from their struggles and triumphs continue to resonate not just in history, but in our understanding of power, leadership, and what it means to be a woman in control. By examining the complexities of their rivalry, we see not just two queens fighting for power, but two women navigating a world where their every decision was scrutinized, their actions seen through the lens of their gender. Their rivalry, though rooted in political and religious conflict, was also a struggle for agency and control in a time when women in power were often forced to fight harder for legitimacy than their male counterparts. Today, their story continues to serve as a powerful reminder of the obstacles women face in positions of power and the ways in which they can transcend those challenges to shape history. As we dig deeper into their rivalry, we'll uncover not only the personal drama, but also the political, religious, and cultural ramifications of their lives. Elizabeth and Mary were two sides of the same coin, two queens from different worlds, yet forever intertwined by their shared struggle for power, and their legacy is far from over. The more we learn about their lives, the more we see that their rivalry was not just a battle for the throne, but a struggle for the future of England itself. A rivalry between Elizabeth I and Mary, Queen of Scots, is one of the most fascinating and complex stories in history. But did you know it wasn't just about a battle for the English throne? On the surface, their clash seems like two women fighting for power, but in reality, there was so much more beneath the surface. Their struggle was about religion, politics, identity, and survival in a world dominated by men. And despite what many might think, their rivalry was never as simple as a question of who would rule England. There were larger, deeper forces at play that shaped their fates, and their rivalry is still relevant today. So, what happened between these two powerful queens, and why does their story still captivate us? We're about to dive into the details of their rivalry and explore how their personal struggles intersected with the larger political and religious conflicts of the time. Stick with me as we uncover the hidden complexities behind Elizabeth and Mary's bitter relationship. When we think of queens, we often think of them as figures of immense power, but the reality is much more complicated, especially for Elizabeth I and Mary, Queen of Scots. Both were queens, but their worlds couldn't have been more different. Elizabeth grew up in the shadow of her father, Henry VIII, in a court filled with political danger and religious turmoil. Her legitimacy as queen was constantly questioned, and her very survival was never guaranteed. Her mother, Anne Boleyn, was executed when Elizabeth was just 2 years old, leaving her to navigate a world where threats to her throne were always looming. Mary, on the other hand, had a very different childhood. Raised in France, she was groomed for royalty, living in a secure and powerful environment. Her claim to the throne was strong, and her early years were filled with luxury and political alliances. But Mary's life was far from smooth. She was forced to flee her own kingdom at a young age after her first marriage ended in tragedy, marking the beginning of a life filled with political struggles and betrayals. These two queens, from such different backgrounds, would come to represent two different versions of England and two very different approaches to power. Their personal histories would fuel their rivalry for years to come, with each woman seeing the other as a threat to her own reign. We often think of Elizabeth as the one who held the power, but Mary's claim to the English throne was just as legitimate. In fact, Mary was a direct descendant of Henry VII, making her a legitimate heir in the eyes of many Catholic factions. This became a huge point of contention, especially since Elizabeth's Protestant supporters viewed Mary as a dangerous Catholic rival. To many Catholics, Elizabeth's reign was seen as illegitimate because of her mother's marriage to Henry VIII, which they considered invalid. What was at stake wasn't just personal power, it was the very direction of England's religious future. Elizabeth's Protestantism was seen as a threat to the Catholic world, and Mary, a Catholic, became a figurehead for those who hoped to see England return to the true faith. But it wasn't just a matter of religion. This clash of dynasties meant that both women had powerful factions within England plotting for their success. This wasn't just a personal rivalry, it was a fight over the future of England, and it was fueled by the religious and political tensions of the time. The religious divide between Elizabeth and Mary was, in many ways, the spark that ignited their rivalry. Elizabeth, the Protestant queen, was the face of the English Reformation, while Mary, a devout Catholic, became the symbol of Catholic resistance. This divide wasn't just a matter of belief, it was a matter of survival. Religion in Tudor England was tied to political power, and the implications of being on the wrong side could mean not only the loss of political power, but also the threat of execution. As Protestantism gained ground in England, Mary's Catholic sympathies made her a target for those who saw her as a direct threat to the Protestant establishment. Catholic plots to overthrow Elizabeth were common, and Mary became a key figurehead for those wishing to see her on the throne. Elizabeth in turn saw Mary as a dangerous rival, a woman who could unite England's Catholics against her and potentially take her crown. What many don't realize, though, is that this wasn't just a fight between two queens. It was a much larger, much more dangerous political game, and it was one that would play out over many years, with both women using religion as a powerful weapon in their fight for the throne. But despite their shared role as monarchs, Elizabeth and Mary's approaches to power couldn't have been more different. Elizabeth, the Virgin Queen, was known for her strategic decision to never marry. For her, marriage was never a personal choice, it was a political one. She remained unmarried to keep control over her reign, making sure that no man would have influence over her or her throne. Elizabeth's refusal to marry was seen as a sign of strength in a world where women in power were often expected to marry for political alliances. However, her decision left her vulnerable to attacks from those who wanted to see her replaced with a Catholic monarch. Mary, on the other hand, used marriage as a tool for survival. Her first marriage to the French Dauphin gave her power in Europe, but his sudden death left her vulnerable. Her second marriage to Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, was filled with scandal, violence, and political intrigue. His murder, which many believe Mary was complicit in, shocked the world and set the stage for her downfall. Mary's third marriage to the Earl of Bothwell was even more scandalous, making her deeply unpopular among both her supporters and her enemies. Elizabeth's refusal to marry and Mary's disastrous relationships played a key role in shaping their rivalry. While Elizabeth's political prowess kept her in power, Mary's turbulent marriages contributed to her undoing. The Babington Plot is one of the most infamous conspiracies of the Tudor era, and it brought Mary's fate to a tragic end. The plot, which involved Catholic supporters trying to assassinate Elizabeth and place Mary on the throne, was uncovered by Elizabeth's spies. Mary's involvement in the conspiracy was enough to seal her fate. Despite her claim to the throne and the support she had from Catholic factions in England and abroad, her involvement in the Babington Plot turned her from a mere political rival into a direct threat to Elizabeth's life. Elizabeth's spies had uncovered the plot in time, and Mary's letters implicating her in the conspiracy were enough to convince Elizabeth that Mary was a real danger. In the end, Mary's execution was not just about her personal rivalry with Elizabeth, it was about eliminating the very real threat she posed to the Protestant monarchy. As Mary's life was cut short, Elizabeth's struggles were far from over. The execution of Mary left Elizabeth victorious in the short term, but it created long-lasting political and religious tensions. Catholic factions within England were enraged by Mary's execution execution, and Protestant radicals began to see Elizabeth as a target as well. Even after her cousin's death, Elizabeth would never fully escape the shadow of Mary's legacy. But Elizabeth's reign continued to flourish. With Mary out of the picture, Elizabeth cemented her place in history. She would go on to lead England into a new era, one defined by military triumphs, cultural achievements, and the beginnings of the English Golden Age. But as the years passed, Elizabeth would face new challenges, and she would come to realize that, despite her victory over Mary, the tensions between Protestant and Catholic factions would never fully disappear. Now, if you enjoyed this epic journey, please subscribe to our channel for more thrilling historical tales. Don't miss out on new videos. Hit the notification bell to stay updated.